Don't worry about it.
This thing work. Hola. Stephen? Yes, please.
Oh, it isn't. Hello, testing, test. Hello. Okay, it's on. Go ahead.
Let me move this thing here. Here we go. Ta-da! So, Shabbat Shalom. I'm George Klass, and you all know Miriam Abramovitz. So this is really exciting to have our two guests here. I've been trying to organize this. We've been trying to organize this forever. To have Jeffrey Ornstein and Lois Roman. Jeffrey is the chairman of the Memorial Scroll Trust, and Lois is the U.S. representative and a trustee. Between the two of them, they really run the show. This is a very small organization. Jeffrey is peripatetic. He is hard to pin down. He was brought up in New Zealand, moved to South Africa, and then has traveled all around the world. I'm not going to tell you where he lives, where he's from, because as soon as he opens his mouth, you will know. And it ain't from the Bronx. Jeffrey has been the chairman for about a decade now, and is really the global ambassador for these Holocaust scrolls that his organization saved 60 years ago. 60 years ago. In fact, as an aside, tomorrow there's a big event. It's the 60th anniversary of these scrolls being saved, and it's at Temple Emmanuel. Some 700-800 people will be there, including 70 scrolls. And that includes ours. We will be there with a bunch of people, Miriam and Stephen, parading. A group from BJ is going. If any of you are interested, please let me know, because we've got to register you, because security is going to be tight. But that's going to be a very interesting event. Anyway, so, Jeffrey's mission has been to keep the memory of these scrolls going around the world. These 1,500 scrolls have been circulated to some 30 countries around the world. That's how we managed to get one. Lois, as the American representative here, kind of sees over all of the scrolls that are distributed throughout the U.S. The U.S. is the largest depository of scrolls, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of synagogues and institutions that have them. And by the way, Lois organized tomorrow's event single-handedly, which is amazing when you think about it. Lois was educated. She went to Brandeis Yeshiva University, where she got a master's in Holocaust studies and genocide, and an MBA from Columbia University. But without doubt, her greatest achievement was getting married at BJ. Can't top that. Jeffrey will tell us about the memorial scrolls and how they came to be and their history. What I'd like to do is to take a couple of minutes to tell you how we managed to get this scroll here. Back in 1990, I heard that scrolls were available, and I really wanted to get one for my shul. The reason this was particularly meaningful for me is because my family came from Czechoslovakia. Between my mom and dad, probably 40 members of the family perished in the Holocaust, and I never knew any of them. So I grew up without grandparents, uncles, and aunts. We got our scroll, and at a very, very emotional, moving dedication ceremony, I welcomed the scroll as if it was my family coming to the BJ family. And on that occasion, I wore my grandfather's talit. It was a talit that grandfather gave my dad before grandfather was sent off to Auschwitz. And then my grandfather gave it to me. And that talit is here, covering the scroll. The scroll is not kosher. It needs some maintenance, and because of that, it cannot be used in services. But we do use it for Simchat Torah, Yom Kippur, and for Shoah. We were led to believe that it was 100 years old. But this summer, something really miraculous happened. They discovered some documentation in the Prague Jewish Museum that in fact dates it as 300 years old. This is a 300 years old Torah. Think about that. That makes it older than BJ and older than the United States. And we are privileged to be the stewards of this magnificent piece of work. We've had so far, take a look at it, Rabbi Hale. He has authenticated the date, and he's looked at the ink, and he says it's the same ink that was used in writing the American Declaration of Independence. And it's the same parchment. So this scroll embodies not only 300 years of East European history, but has a connection to us. You know, I was struck by how this Shabbat is really quite spectacular when you think about it. Because earlier today, we had the kids, the teenage Shabbat, the energy, the youth of the next generation. And here this afternoon, we've got a scroll with some age, the wisdom. So you've got the energy and the wisdom, two beautiful bookends of who we are as a people. Jeffrey's going to take us through all of this. One more thing I need to tell you about this scroll is that not only is it so old, but the calligraphy is very, very special. It has Kabbalistic influences. And the Shofar told us it's more than just a Torah. It's really a work of art. After Jeffrey has spoken, we'll have a Q&A, and then a very, very special treat for all of you. We'll open the scroll up, and you'll be able to come up in groups and look at it. And Lois will point out to us the individualistic letters and the Kabbalah tropes, and you'll really see it's something quite special. I need to thank a bunch of people. I want to thank the rabbinate for being so supportive of this. I want to thank the Archives Committee, and particularly my new best friend Stephen, wherever he is, Stephen Friedgood, and his one wife Dova, who made all the pieces come together. Now, because the scroll is going to be used tomorrow in the procession, and because BJ is closed tomorrow, we're not able to return it to BJ. So we've made arrangements with this Czech scroll to spend the night at Miriam's apartment. So Miriam will be sleeping with a Czech at her age. Now that's a mitzvah. Miriam Abramovitz, who has done our show-up programs, and the Archives Committee would like to say a few words.
Thank you, George. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I just want to welcome Jeffrey and Lois. We're delighted to have you here with us. And George, for his ongoing desire that we know more and more about this Torah. And we do take it out for Yom HaShoah. And it sits in the arms. People sit here and hold on to it. And we've been doing that for over 20 years. So this is a very moving moment. And I'm delighted that we were able to work with Stephen and Dova, without whom this could not have happened either. So thank you very much, and I'm glad you're here. Thank you for having come. Shabbat Shalom.
Chavarim, Jeffrey Ornstein.
Shabbat Shalom. Can you all hear me? You understand what I'm saying? Slightly different accent. Okay. We all speak, well, we speak similar languages, not quite the same. Actually, before saying anything, I just really want to say what a great pleasure it is for me to be here, and particularly to have taken part in an amazing service. As you look at me, you can see that I'm one of the younger members of your community that come here. But despite that, I've always been interested in succession. I was fortunate to have my own business for many years, and I was interested in what was going to happen after me. When I got involved with the Westminster Synagogue, which I was chairman of for 7 years, again, people always say I speak too loud. Most important thing for me was to find a successor, and you know that in synagogues it's sometimes very hard to find that. Since working as a trustee and chairman of the Memorial Scrolls Trust for 10 years, again, succession is important. When I saw the kids today, I knew that this community has succession. You've got a wonderful community. I thought when I was watching them, I'd like to take some of them back to London with me. As they say, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you for that. Thank you, George, for introducing me, and Miriam, and also for enabling this to happen. And also I must say my thanks to Lois as well. Since she met me a few years ago, a few months later she came to the Trust in London to see our museum, and then a few weeks later she said, Hineni, I want to work with you. And she's been a tremendous help here in America, and also as a trustee, because nowadays everything's done remotely and means we can communicate very easily. So that's just the background. If you want to know a little bit about me very quickly, yes, I am a bit peripatetic. I was born in England, first few years in New Zealand, came back to England, then university in South Africa, back to England, married a girl from Buenos Aires, working life 7 times a year in the Far East. And I suppose that put me in good condition to work with the scrolls. So this year, particularly our 60th year, I'm traveling as often as I can to attend events and scroll gatherings. I just came back from Buenos Aires last week. After tomorrow, next week, I will be in Los Angeles for 2 events in Sherman Oaks and Fullerton. So that's the background. Now let's talk more important things. Let's talk about the scrolls. Okay. I assume, I'm hoping that most of you are coming tomorrow, so I don't want to spend too long talking about the history of the Jews and how it happened, but I'll give a very 5-minute background that just so you're aware, because whenever somebody comes to our museum in London and we show them 1,500 scrolls, I said, look, you can go to a big synagogue and you can see sometimes 20, 30 scrolls. So what's special about these scrolls? What's special is the place it came from. They all came from one area, and the people that use the scrolls. Okay, Jews have been in Bohemia, Moravia, which is the area we're talking about, although it was known as a country in Czechoslovakia since after the First World War. But the scrolls all came from Bohemia, Moravia, because it was collected under the German protectorate. So Jews have lived in this area. Certainly is recorded since the 10th century, and there are records not records, but indications they came with the Romans. The first few hundred years after that, the Jewish experience there was no different to anywhere else. Welcomed, expelled, libels, pogroms, no better, no worse. What is unusual about it, though, is in this area there are never more than 120,000 Jews. So it's not like in Lithuania, in Poland, in Germany, in Russia, where there are millions. This never had more than 120,000 Jews. And also, they weren't congregated in one area. So you had the Pale of Russia, or you had very large communities. Other than Prague and Brno, the capitals of Bohemia and Moravia, there were, well, in 1850, over 500 communities. So the average number of people were less than maybe one family. 350 cemeteries. And if you go back to 1700, Prague had the largest Jewish population of anywhere in Western world. So there were 11,000 Jews in 1700. You think that's not a lot compared to New York now, but in London there were 1,000 Jews. Maybe here in New York, maybe 100. So it was very important. It always also shot above its weight. It had a lot of famous yeshivas, Orthodox. The chief rabbi of Poland at one time was chief rabbi the chief rabbi of Prague at one time was chief rabbi of Poland. And at the same time, they were very interested in alternatives like Shabbatai Tzvi, the false prophets, and Frank. And also it became a center of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, of the progressive movements. That possibly because halfway between Germany and between Berlin and Vienna. So it was always a very, very unusual background. So that's just to tell you that this is not just a typical Eastern European bloc. So the question is then, how and why did the scrolls survive? And what happened to them afterwards? Well, I don't want to really go through modern history, but you know, the Germans invaded this area. Originally it was Kristallnacht, which Sudetenland was all destroyed. Jews had a week to live. Slovakia, where George's family came from, run by Tiso, a nasty piece of work. Jews tried to run away from them, and they ran into Czechoslovakia, because actually it was to Bohemia and Moravia, because at that time it actually had the best army in Europe. but unfortunately your government and my government didn't support them, and they saw no way they could fight the Germans and folded. So the Germans came in to Bohemia Moravia, and immediately they started imposing horrible restrictions on the Jews. And it was a very slow thing, so people got used to it. So the first day was maybe you had to wear an armband. Then you could only go to the shops on certain days of the week. Then you couldn't go to school. So it was a slow deterioration. People got used to it. There were 120,000 Jews. Of those 120,000 Jews, some 87,800 were deported, 78,000 were murdered. So what happened to the others? Over 20,000 actually miraculously survived. And they survived if they could fulfill two functions. Number one, they could pay a ridiculous tax, which the Nazis insisted on. And number two, a country would give them a visa. And I can say this as a British, excuse me saying it, because I say it to visitors in the museum. Unfortunately, my country and your country did nothing to save the Jews of this area, or many in Europe either. Who saved them? Who saved them? The people who saved them were the countries that our countries put across as being fascist and Nazi. The Jews that were saved went to Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. These were the countries, and a few went to Switzerland. So most of the Jews perished, but all the Judaica was there. Miraculously it survived. How it survived is a strange story. In fact, the rabbi earlier said, his commentary was, which many people believed blindly, that the Nazis wanted a museum of an extinct race. I should add that there's two sides to that story, because the historians, many historians today, particularly one, Magda Wieselska, historian at the Jewish Museum of Prague, has written a long article saying that wasn't the case, that in fact it was the Jews that were so clever that they, despite not being able to save themselves, saved the Judaica. So let's just look and examine that. So as I said to you, there were originally 550 communities. So if you came down to 1939, there were still about 150 communities, partly because Jews had emigrated, they'd gone to the bigger cities, etc. But there were still 150 active communities in 1939. When the Nazis came in, they made them all go to the bigger cities. So the Jewish population of Prague went from something like 30,000 to 60,000, so nearly half the Jews of the country were in the one city. During that period, one of the guys in charge in Prague was a nasty piece of work called Hans Gunther, who considered himself an academic, a bibliophile. So he had his sidekick called Ram write to the communities telling them, you have to send all your books, send your books, your valuable books. Well, maybe they didn't send the good ones because somebody wrote to them, why should they send them to the Nazis? So after that, when that happened, and some of them were collected, the Jewish community, the people working in the Jewish community in Prague, one particular fellow called Karol Stein actually came up with a proposal that said, look, where the stuff is, the Jews are no longer in the synagogues, it's being stolen by the locals. So it would be much better and safer if we brought everything to Prague in one, keep it under lock and key, because, you know, this is a pogrom. They never believed they were going to be murdered. We have a lot of records, a lot of stories that even in 1942-43, by which time 25% of all European Jews were dead, shot, before the concentration camps got into real active murder. But in this area, they could not believe. They all mostly spoke German, they're very well educated generally, and they couldn't believe this was going to happen to them. So they thought they'd bring it in and it'd be safekeeping, and at the end of the war, they'd come back and collect it. So we know that a letter was sent out from the community to from the community in Prague to every community in Bohemia Moravia, send all your Judaica, all your Jewish artifacts from the community, not the private, to Prague, and that will be kept there. So we don't know why the Nazis allowed this to happen. Okay, they used Jewish labor, they used Jewish money, they used Jewish buildings, but what they didn't have, I mean, they came from 118 towns, more than 200,000 items, and they went in wartime by train. So for the Nazis to do it just to keep the Jews quiet, it's not a good answer. One could say they were looking for the silver, but when they got the silver, they didn't melt it down. Maybe, possibly that Hans Gunther was going to have his own museum at the end of the war. We'll never know. There's no records proving it, and there's no records proving the Jews saved it. All we know, the miracle happened. The miracle happened, and more than 200,000 items were stored in 40 buildings in the center of Prague. And miraculously, although there was bombing, it came to the outside of the edges of Prague, but no bombing came to the center. So all this Judaica survived the Shoah. It's extraordinary. So at the end of the war, there were only about 14,000 Jews in the Czech lands, no, not Slovakia, in Bohemia, Moravia. And they weren't just the Jews, because people had been sent to Theresienstadt, which was the holding camp. I've got to keep this short. I was actually told to tell you everything. And the answer was, if you've got a week, I'll tell you everything. But as I don't have, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut. A bit of history comes out of it. So excuse me if I'm missing something. You can ask me any question afterwards. So at the end of the war, there were 14,000 Jews, and many of those were able to leave. Some went to what was then Palestine, some came to America, Britain, and other countries. And they, as I said, they weren't all Czechs. And immediately the community that was left sent out thousands of items. Whoever wanted anything, they had. So there were 52 communities restarted after the war. And then there was another tragedy. 1948 was a communist coup. And the communist coup, for me, was an extra tragedy. And I think it is for you as well, because most of the leaders of the communists were actually Jews. But they, as I call them, they were biological Jews. They had no love for the religion. Their love was for Stalin, which didn't help them, because in 1954 they were nearly all hung. But in 1948, they closed all the synagogues. So everything was sent back to, or should have been sent. Some stuff went missing, but that's another story. But everything was sent back to the Jewish Museum. And strangely enough, even under the communists, they allowed the museum to stay open, because they treated it as an anti-Nazi, anti-fascist museum, and they could display things. However, they weren't interested in Sifrei Torah. They weren't interested in anything religious. They took off the mantles and they put them on display. They had the Riminim, they had the Yads, they had breastplates, but the Torah they kept aside. Initially they left them in the warehouses, and then these warehouses were in the center of Prague, which, I don't know how many of you have been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. There were valuable buildings. So a few years later, they dumped them, literally dumped them, in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, which had been the former Michla synagogue. And they put them there. And you know, all Torah is made from animal skin, vellum, and it's all biodegradable. So eventually, if you keep a scroll long enough, it will, the material either will become rigid or become fragile. It will eventually disappear. And they were left lying there. Had they stayed there until the Velvet Revolution in 1989, there's no question in my mind there would have been almost nothing left, because the warehouse was damp. It had the Czech weather. One day it's hot, one day it's cold, it's rainy. It's not. They had a guy who came and opened the windows once a day to let the air in. I mean, that was how they were looked after. So they were lying there, uncared for, unwanted, and people didn't even know about it. To give you an idea how little they knew about it, our emeritus rabbi at the Westminster Synagogue, Dr. Thomas Salomon, actually, he's also Slovak. He's from Kozice, and he studied to be a rabbi partly in Prague. And when he came to London from the Czech Republic, he never knew anything about the Czech scrolls, which had already been in London for 15 years. So it was all kept hidden under the communists. So how did they actually survive? In 1963, 62, 63, the communists were looking for hard exchange, hard currency. So they decided they wanted to sell stuff, but they wanted to sell stuff that they didn't want that other people would. And they said, oh, the Jews have got money, they'll buy the Torah. At the same time, the chief rabbi in Jerusalem was actually looking for Torah because there were more people going to Israel. So they were talking to the chief rabbi, but of course he wanted kosher scrolls. And as you can imagine, everyone who works with Israel, they didn't really want to pay too much for them. So a deal wasn't done, because they wanted to sell everything and they wanted the money they thought. Around that time, in 1963, there was an American art dealer called Eric Esterick who lived in London. And he had a gallery, a Grosvenor Gallery, and he was buying works of art behind the Iron Curtain. And he'd heard there was possibly would be a scroll somewhere, because he knew it was Judaica there. So when he went to Prague one year, he asked the artier who in charge of export, do you have a scroll? I'd like one for my father, who was living in Miami. And they said, look, come with me. So they took him to the warehouse and they showed him all these scrolls. And they said, it's all or nothing. And he said, well, I can say it. He wasn't a particularly nice man. He was a money man. And I can say that because I found out later he was married to my grandmother's cousin. My life is full of connections. Everywhere I go, I seem to find somebody. I even found a cousin here in New York who I never knew existed, who survived the Shoah. His grandfather was my grandfather's sister. And we only discovered each other a few years ago. So I'm full of connections. So there's another one. And he was not interested in himself, but he had a wonderful, wonderful client who for me is the savior of the story. And I always believe that you must remember people by mentioning their names. His name was Ralph Yablon. And Ralph Yablon was a philanthropist. In fact, he was a founder member of the Westminster Synagogue. He'd helped them buy the buildings, a magnificent building in London. And Esterick asked him, would you help? Yablon paid all the money for these scrolls. He spoke to the rabbi in London and said, I'll donate them to the synagogue. Don't want anything. Not only do I want anything, I don't want my name mentioned. It's quite common, people like to the names put up. Moshe Rabbeinu paid for this and Chaimi Cohen paid for that. He would not have his name mentioned. And in fact, for many years, people didn't even know that he paid the scrolls. And I make a point of remembering him now, because at 60 years, he's been dead many years, but his children and grandchildren need to know what this man did. So Ralph Yablon paid for all the scrolls, and they came to London on a horrible winter's day in February 1964 on the back of trucks, 2 trucks. And we even had to pay for the plastic bags to put them in, because they didn't have covers. And they came put in a hall, like bodies. 1,500, can you imagine 1,564 just piled up like that? So they came to London, and that's where they were. There's no more money to do anything. About 10% were kosher. And although the Westminster Synagogue was, I talk about progressive and orthodox. I come from an orthodox background, but I know there's orthodox that go from Haredi down to conservative who are Shomrei Shabbat. And then, so I rather make distinctions. If you don't mind, I just use orthodox being Shomrei Shabbat and above, others progressive, all types. So Westminster Synagogue is a progressive synagogue, but it still actually gave preference to the Orthodox community for the kosher scrolls. The kosher ones went out, nearly all to Orthodox communities, and then they didn't know what to do. And remarkably, a few months later, a man came knocking on the door, a traveling scribe from Israel, and he'd been to the Israeli embassy up the road. Do you know anyone who's got a scroll to repair? And they're secular. There's a synagogue down the road. They came and knocked on the door, And the door was opened by a lady who was really multilingual, Ruth Schapper. Her father had been Sholem Asch, the great Yiddish poet. So she knew Yiddish, and she knew Polish and Russian and Hebrew, and so she could speak to him. He said, "A scroll to repair? Come in." Ran upstairs to the rabbi and said, "I think we've got the answer to our prayers." And he repaired these scrolls, coming backwards and forwards from Israel for nearly 30 years. And at times he stayed in London, he went back. And in fact, our rabbi went, he died 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and the rabbi went to, just we saw him before he left, and he was ultra-Orthodox. I mean, he was what you call Haredi today. He wouldn't shake hands with somebody. He brought his own food and drink. When the lady mayoress came to see him, he wouldn't touch her hand. He said, "Excuse me." But there he was working in a progressive community. And in London, it's much more polarized than here in New York. I must say, we are not. They haven't learned how to live together very nicely in the communities. But he really did something special. So the rabbi asked him, he said, "So for David, why is it that you, this ultra-Orthodox sofa, how could you be working in this environment where there's a synagogue in the building, a progressive synagogue, and you know the scrolls are going to non-Orthodox communities, progressive?" I was doing holy work. And that, I think, is the work of the trust that we've carried on. We like to think that it's sacred work that we're doing. So since that time, some 1,400 scrolls have been shipped to 1,300 communities and organizations around the world. You can find them from Alaska to New Zealand, from Mumbai to Buenos Aires. There's about, I've got to be careful when I say America. My wife coming from Argentina, and as you know this, they don't like me to say America as a country. I've got to say USA, or North America. So let's call it the Americas. There's about 1,000 scroll in the Americas. Most of it is in North America and Canada. And the rest we have in Israel. We have, as George said, I've not counted the countries, but maybe there's 50 countries, I don't know. And they've been sent out. So that is what has happened. Most of the collection all went out by 20 years ago. But we never sold, and we didn't donate. We allocate them on what is euphemistically called as permanent loan, which is defined to mean that it's yours as long as you exist. But if for financial or economic reasons, geographical reasons, sometimes communities move, or you merge with another community, you don't use the scroll, you don't need the scroll, it comes back to us so we can allocate it to another community. So I like to think of ourselves as the trust now being the head and the community is the body. It's not us. I mean, George was very generous to say that we're doing the work. It's not us doing the work. We get the yichus. You're the guys doing the work. You're the guys who honor the scrolls, who use the scrolls. And we're the people who give you the information. So some of the things I'll talk first about what we do, and then I'll talk about what the communities do. So since I can only talk for the last 10 years that I've been trustee. I don't like to talk about what happened with other people because I wasn't there. But we've become very active, much more active than before. I tried, certainly before COVID, I was coming 2 or 3 times a year to events to make sure people knew we cared. You have a scroll from the trust, but you need to know the history of it, where it came from, who were the people. Remember it, because these towns, some of these towns were small. Everybody disappeared. But their transport lists, you know, one of my teachers was actually he studied in America, Albert Friedlander, Rabbi Albert Friedlander, and he said to me, I asked him once, how did he view eternity? And he said, immortality. And he said, being remembered. So that's why I mentioned his name, I mentioned Yablon's name. But it's important. If your scroll comes from a town, there's no one to remember them. They're just lost in 6 million. It's just a digit. But when you know that these people, they read from the Torah, they lifted the Torah, the same scroll that you're doing, and you can remember them, that's a great, great mitzvah. So we do that. We have a Facebook page. We keep pushing stuff into it, and hopefully a few people read it. We issue a newsletter, which we now allocate, we send out to 5,000 people, and I'm told we get 33% clicks, which is well above the average. I'm not techie, but my IT guys, who are volunteers a lot for us, tells me we're doing pretty well. And we encourage people to use the scrolls. And where possible, I mean, when we allocate a scroll, we don't put any demands on the people. Some people, we allocate all different types of scrolls to all different types of people. So just to give you an example, in the last 2 or 3 months, I've sent one to Great Neck, to an Orthodox community, young Israel community, and they only want it as Apostle Scroll as a memorial. They've got lots of Torah, they don't want it. Then we also sent one which had to be made glut kosher for a very Orthodox community in Santiago de Chile. They're going to use it all the time. Every B'nai Mitzvah is going to read from it. So we get all different types and things. But what has happened over the years is a phenomena. Now, in the old days, when we first sent them out, if you had a scroll and it was either kosher or it wasn't kosher. If it wasn't kosher, you really didn't do much with it. Why? Because it was so expensive to repair. So when during that period, it was almost cheaper to buy a new Sefer Torah than to restore a Sefer Torah, so no one was doing it. But what has happened over the last 10, 20, 30 years, it's become more and more and more expensive to buy a new Sefer Torah. People do write new Sefer Torah, so now people are looking at their older Sefer Torah and say, well, can we restore it? Can we use it? So we don't demand this, but we are finding more often than ever before, communities look at it. If it's, I don't know this one, you'll have to have a sofa look at that to tell, but they're looking at it. And they will tell you whether it's to be restored or not, I don't know. The communities are doing wonderful work as well. Communities have annual celebrations, they have if they work out the names of the transport list, they honor their memory either on a special Shabbat or on Yom Kippur or something like that. They use their scrolls not just for laning from, not just for services. They also use them as you do for Hakafot on Kol Nidre, on Simchat Torah, but also if you do interfaith work, remember, the scroll is the Pentateuch. And also the scroll is the Al Torah, the 5 books of Musa in Islam. So I just wanted, before I finish, I want to talk to you a little bit about this scroll, which is really quite exceptional. I say that every Sefer Torah is exceptional. Every Sefer Torah is sacred, but this one has got some interesting things that other people don't. So what actually happened, in our records, this scroll came from a town called Domazlice. And Domazlice was a small anti-Semitic town, not far from Pilsen, near the border of Germany, where in 1850 they only allowed 3 Jewish families to live there. The maximum number of Jews, about 70, 80 Jews, no more lived there. However, on our list, because they came from collection towns, they didn't come from every town, we have 29 scrolls came from Domazlice. So we know they didn't all come from Domazlice. But we don't know we talk about the provenance being the collection town they came from, but they must have come from all surrounding towns. Then about 4 years ago, I was told in Prague that because they have so many records, that even after 60 years, they didn't have the money to examine every single, they've got thousands of everything, 200,000 items. So they discovered a previously unresearched file, which we paid to have restored. And we discovered some earlier provenance. And we discovered that 11 of the scrolls actually came from a town called Stankov, which is not very far away, and it had merged with Domazlice. It was very exciting. So we then, and in fact, I was just shown the certificate, that we sent a new certificate of authenticity saying this is not a scroll from Domazlice, it's a scroll from Stankov. Well, I don't know how long ago, it was a few months ago, I think, George, yes, when Sofer Kevin Hale is one of our authorized Sofrim, and he came to examine this scroll. And he wrote to me, something extraordinary happened. when he opened it completely, he looked on the wood of the eights, and you can see these are the original poles, and he saw written on the wood, on the pole, was the word Kolodec, which is another town. Amazing. So we now know it would only be written there because it came from there. And there was a community, and they had scrolls, and obviously this is the only scroll that survived from Kolodec. Found its way to Stankov. From Stankov it's found its way to Domazlice. Domazlice came to Prague. Prague came to us, and now it's with you. It's just one of the most extraordinary scrolls in our collection. I say every scroll is extraordinary, everyone, but this has a story. I don't know of anyone quite like that. I've found 2 or 3 communities where you get 2 or 3. Is the only one, I believe, where we only have one scroll from a community that we've discovered. So really, it's a fantastic thing. Okay, I've been waffling on, and as I say, unfortunately, once I get started, I can carry on forever. But I want to go back just when I try to finish every talk with the same comment. And when I talk to you about the Torah, I always say that the Torah is the one thing that binds all Jews together. It doesn't matter whether you believe in Torah min hashamayim, God wrote history in advance to Moses, or you believe, as many progressive Jews do, it was compiled a couple of thousand years later, possibly under Ezra. It is the one thing that binds Jews together. We must remember, every Jew must remember, that the Torah is also revered as the Pentateuch by the Christians, and also by Torah as the Muslims. So we, in the Memorial Scrolls Trust, one of our most important missions, and particularly at this time, I don't want to talk about what's going on at the moment. You know, that's a separate, we're not involved with politics, and we're not involved with the terrible things that are happening in the world today. But what we like and pray and hope for, that in some small way, our scrolls are used to remind people of what we have in common, rather than what divides us. Thank you very much. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm only too happy to try and answer. Test me. You have to speak up. I'm afraid age has taken over the... You're talking about in 1964. I don't have the exact numbers because I think every scroll was examined and some of them might have needed minor work. But we estimated, because I think at the time they put them in 5 categories, and we estimate the category 1, which was the best, which either was kosher or neo, possibly something like 10%. Something like 10%. Sorry. Sorry.
We don't have a microphone. Let me take this off. I'll give it to you, and then everybody can hear.
This is more of a personal question because I am from Buenos Aires. I'd like to know where the scroll is housed in Buenos Aires.
As you know, my connection with Buenos Aires through my wife, and I love the city. I've been going there for over 50 years regularly. I was aware, I must tell, this is there's lots of stories, so this was a story. I heard there was a scroll in Buenos Aires. My late father-in-law was president of the largest Jewish community in Libertad for many years, but he died, unfortunately, quite young. And I was told the scroll was there. And I went there, they knew nothing about the scroll, so they then sent me to Belgrano, another NCIS, and the fellow there was a fellow called Pedro Smoller, who was a 90-year-old guy, and he said, oh, I bought this scroll from London, and it's sitting in the Ark. Actually, I looked at it, and I said to myself, I didn't think it was, but the Rabbi of Rudge at the time was the rabbi there. He said, Jeffrey, he said, look, he's 90 years old, make him happy. Let's call that one. Later on, we'll talk about it. So a couple of years later, I was back, and I was certain it hadn't been thrown away. So I went back to Libertad, and the head of the museum was Rabbi Mogilevsky, and they really weren't happy with foreigners coming in, English people coming in and asking questions. But fortunately, he knew my late father-in-law. He'd worked under him and opened doors. There's another connection. And one thing led to another, and we found the scroll was at Libertad. So we had one scroll there. Following that, another year later, I was contacted by a lady, Graciela Grimberg. I'm trying to think, too many synagogues. It's on the outskirts. I think it's, I can't remember the name, I'm sorry. It's just a bit far out of town, but on the edge of Buenos Aires, and she wanted a scroll. And at the same time, there was somebody else from America wanted us to allocate a scroll to Rabbi Skorka's synagogue, which is also in Palermo. So I ended up taking 2 scrolls in a golf bag to Buenos Aires for these 2 synagogues. And in fact, I was in Buenos Aires 3 or 4 weeks ago and one I should mention, talking about polarization, one is conservative, one is Masorti, and one is Reform. So we met on neutral ground. Museo del Holocausto, we had a lovely ceremony, not that big, but it was beautiful. So we have the 3 scrolls in Buenos Aires, and now we're talking to a community in Cordoba, is looking.
Let me make
Okay.
You mentioned Kabbalistic inferences. What were they?
Well, you know, the art of Sefrut is an extensive ancient art, because the scrolls were originally, the sofa was in fact in ancient times more important than a rabbi. And they wrote in many, many styles. So some of the people were influenced by the Kabbalah. And within, I don't know if you know much about Kabbalah, there's a lot of mysticism involved, and the Sofrim decided to write certain signs, shapes within the letters that I think Lars is going to show you in a second. So those were the different signs. The most common is the Peh. You can see a Zion and Lamed, you see different types of letters. But there's lots of variations. You've got funny letters. Maimonides spoke about funny letters. You've got reverse Lameds. You've got all sorts of things. I mean, it's an art. It's a science and an art together, writing a scroll. Sorry. You want?
Hi. I am curious how one makes a Torah scroll kosher, because I was always under the impression from like a halachic standpoint that...
Sorry? I'm losing you.
Sorry. Like, if a letter is written incorrectly, then it's completely like not kosher. So I'm just curious from a perspective of when you say a Torah scroll that was found is not kosher, how it could be made kosher, or if that's not possible.
Okay, that needs a talk on its own, I'm afraid. There are 4,000 rules about writing a Sefer Torah. There are elements that can be repaired easily. There are elements that can be repaired extensively, takes time, and there's some you can't. Some scrolls have just the letters have flaked off so much you have to rewrite everything. Very difficult to very quickly answer that, but it really depends on the scroll. Some can be easily repaired, some can't. There's one behind.
I was wondering, when we're talking about the repairing of the scrolls, and it's now 2024, and I know there's all these, halachic laws. Do you think there's any role in 3D printing and really taking things to like having something sacred, but being able to either for the repair of the ones or to make new ones? When I hear you say the expense and the labor and all that without losing the sacredness.
I think if you have something handmade, you can't repair it by machine. So you can't print on top of something that's been handwritten. So very quickly on that one, in actual fact, many scrolls today, if we talk about cost in relation to writing a new scroll, you can do a phenomenal amount of work without doing it. But the other bit that you talked about printing scrolls, there's a big problem about that, because that's halakha, and we can't talk about you're not going to change halakha. The halakha does not want you to print. Having said that, I'll tell you one thing, which is an interesting point. Today, all new scrolls, the old scrolls were it's licorice all sorts. Some were with 58 lines, 30 lines, different size columns, 30-inch cloth, 5-inch cloth, any shape and size. Today, every scroll is a Bob scroll. Starts with the letter Bob every column. Every scroll has 42 lines. What does that mean? It means every scroll is virtually identical. What does that mean? With the technology available today, some scrupulous, even Orthodox people are printing. I can tell you that. Okay.
So 60 years ago, Czechoslovakia was a different place than it is today. Now in the cultural world, there's the notion of, in some circles, of bringing objects back to their place of origin. I'll let you take it from there.
You want to know how I feel about that?
Well, or
Okay.
some of the
No,
ones that haven't been.
I'll give you a very simple example.
I'm not saying all of them, but some of the unclaimed ones.
Well, let me answer the question first. A synagogue is like a club, last man standing. When you have a club, and let's say you own this building, the community owns the building. Everyone dies except one man. When you leave the building, you don't get a share of the building. You left the community, you've gone. Last man standing owns the building. Last man dies, belongs to the state. That's the quick answer what happened. The other answer about ownership, about restoration. I don't know if you ever have a second-hand ring or a second-hand house. The grandson of the person you have the house that was sold 100 years ago says, oh, my grandmother lived in that house, it should be restored. So the answer is we have legal title which is accepted, but I'll finish. We have legal title accepted by the Czechs. There were some bad stories about this, but it's now we have a very good relationship with the Jewish Museum. Now the final question, the final part of the question was about scrolls being allocated to Czech Republic, not being returned, being allocated like to anywhere else. They're allocated. So we actually have allocated 2 scrolls already. We only allocate to communities where they can use them. So we don't need to send a postal scroll to the Czech Republic. The whole country, Czechia today, the whole country is a museum, unfortunately. There are lots of old, unused items there. However, in 2017, we had a request from a town called Olomouc, which has a nascent Orthodox community, and a scroll we found in Peninsula City in California. And they actually paid for the scroll to be repaired. It came back to us, and we allocated the scroll. It wasn't returned. It was allocated by the trust to them. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we approached, there was the Quds camp in New York, I don't know if you've heard of it, was closing, and they had 2 scrolls. And the leaders of the Quds camp said they would like one of them to be allocated to a new progressive community in Prague. And actually, this was organized by WUPJ, who we work very closely with, World Union of Progressive Jews. And they arranged, again, for the scroll to be made glut kosher. And it was allocated to a new rabbi. It's a long story, but to a rabbi in the community, David Maxa, Eitz Chaim in Prague. And they actually today have bigger services than the Orthodox community. There are 100, 150 people every Friday night. If there is another community in Prague, or in Czech Republic, that needs a scroll and can arrange for the kosher. We cannot pay for the scroll. We don't have that money to pay for a scroll to be kosher. But if somebody wants to donate a scroll to a community that is active and going to use the scroll meaningfully, we're delighted. But it doesn't go, it's not being returned. It's like anything. It's a work of art that was sold many years ago. Does that answer the question?
Wondering how many Jewish communities are active in Czechoslovakia?
Okay, there are 3,000 Jews in the Czech Republic today. 3,000. 3,000. And the David Maxa goes around the country to where they can put a minyan together and takes our scroll and has services. And the day, please God, will come. There will be more. They're coming out of the woodwork now because because the Shoah in the Czech Republic actually lasted for 60 years, because until 1980, or 50 years, till 1989, and the Jews were treated so badly in this area. So the Jewish experience in that area is so they hid their Jewishness. Now they're beginning to come out. When I go there, people say, oh, my father, my grandfather, my aunt, and they're all becoming interested. So a lot of people, and it's attracted to the progressive. I mean, Chabad is there, Orthodox are there, but you know, it's a different type of person. To volume, you're getting now a lot of interest in the Jewish community. So it is happening. I'm sorry if I took. Oh, you go on more. Okay.
Hi. Okay, I'm reading on the back of this page, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, that there is a scroll on loan to Calvary Hospital in the Bronx, a Catholic institution. Very curious how it ended up at a Catholic hospital, like a Torah scroll. It's just interesting to me, and I was wondering if you could expand upon that.
Well, you've actually hit on my most favorite scroll. The story is there. It goes before my time. About 40. You know. This is, you call it the Catholic hospital. Actually, it's a hospice. I don't know if you know this. It's actually opposite Yeshiva University. Now it handles people regardless of religion or race, people in extremis who have cancer and who are dying. Now in New York, what have you got? 20% are Jewish. And I can tell you in that hospital, 20% are Jewish. So many years ago, they had an Orthodox, or they've always had an Orthodox chaplain, and they had a scroll, many years ago. And they asked for their scroll, about 5-6 years ago, they contacted me. The scroll was no longer kosher, and they estimated, it had been estimated, the cost of repairing the scroll, because it had been really in bad condition, been used so frequently, was $50,000. And I said, this is unbelievable. I said, let me find a scroll which is 90% perfect for you. We'll swap it. You know, we don't mind. You know, you need it, and then you just can pay $5,000 or $10,000. Brescia, he unfortunately died last year. The Professor Brescia, the head medical man, said, no, this scroll is loved by everybody in the hospital. Jews, the Jewish chaplain takes it, the Christian chaplain, the Muslim, they all use it. We're going to raise the money. You know what? They raised $100,000. Non-Jewish people, and they repaired it with one of our sofrim. They didn't want us, you know, they followed all the halachic rules, and it's glak kosher. So for me, I think this is a scroll being used by people in extremists. It's taken from bed to bed. What more could you have from a scroll that survived the Shoah? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes.
Sorry if I'm a bit passionate about some of these answers, because they mean a lot to me.
Hi, as most of you know, my name is Freddie. And in addition to being Gabbai and now Gabbai Emeritus, I was in charge of seeing that the Sifrei Torah were in good repair. And now Dov has taken over and doing a wonderful job. During my tenure as Balat Sifrei Torah, in charge of the Sifrei Torah, the Sofer came in and looked at them and repaired some of them. And also, one of them, after he finished the repair, the Torah was scanned. And the scan was compared against a standard Torah that they knew was kosher, so they could compare the hours versus the standard, identify different areas where there were either ink smudges or spots and letters that needed repair. So technology can be used. I'm technology all my adult life, so long live technology in the right places.
Could I just respond to that? We have a very good friend. As I say, we have friends. We do not believe in split communities. We in the Trust work with, from every part, from the least Orthodox to the most Orthodox, everybody who loves Torah. We don't make and we don't allow people to criticize each other within our work. So one of our great supporters is actually the Orthodox Chief Rabbi of London, Rabbi Mervis. And he has done a lot of support for us, and we've actually allocated a scroll for his use in his home because he has many services there It's allocated on loan like all the others. But as you can imagine, dodgy, orthodox, you have to be very careful, old scroll. So not only did we have it made glut kosher, and I use the word glut because it was done orthodox and checked, we also sent it to, well, it was also photographed and sent to, in fact, I think the scroll was sent to Jerusalem for scanning and checking. And so he said, glut kosher. A few weeks ago, I've had a call, there's been a couple of mistakes that have been picked up, it's got to be corrected. The problem with the computer technology, it doesn't allow for the different style of writing between the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, the Beit Ari, the Beit Yosef, and what I call, well, actually the sophists call Ashkenazi, which is the sort of hybrid scrolls which people have written over 50 years, and it's changed in different styles. So it helps a lot, but this type of technology is not perfect. I just sort of put it underscore. Right? All technology. Exactly.
If there are any other questions, Jeffrey will be available, but I do want to move this along so that you folks can actually see the calligraphy. But you know what? Good things are worth waiting for, aren't they? Jeffrey, thank you so much. I mean, this was a real in-depth explanation, and for us, an understanding of what we have here. And as Jeffrey said, you know, those communities who make their scrolls part of the engagement there are richer for it. I just want a quick show of hands. How many of you knew that we had this 300-year-old scroll? Wow, that's cool. I just wonder whether that's representative of the rest of BJ. Obviously, this is a biased group because you came here. Look, the scroll needs some work. And there's a group of us here who feel that it should be made kosher. And we need to reach out to the community to see if there's support for it. So that, can you imagine the kids this morning who conducted the service, if they were reading from a 300-year-old scroll? Every bar and bat mitzvah that came here would read from a scroll that has so much history. I mean, that's an indelible thing that would be for the rest of their lives, I believe. And so we're going to try to see if we can make this an active part of our community, but we're going to need some help. You know, as for costs and things, because we were talking about scrolls, it would probably take no more than $20,000 to get this kosher. A new scroll is going to cost you $50,000, $60,000, and it will be a cookie cutter scroll, as opposed to a work of art. Okay, to show you the work of art, I'd like you to come up in groups of about half a dozen or so, those who are interested. We'll open it up, and you'll be able to see the calligraphy, and Lois will explain to you the Kabbalistic influences. Just one request, please. Don't touch it, because it's fragile. And any other questions while groups are coming up? Jeffrey's available to answer them. So I tell you what, why don't we do it row by row? This section here, the folks who'd like to come up, and then I'll call the rest of you up. Lois, my dear. And by the way, what we're looking at here is a 300-year-old scroll and a talit that's probably 100 plus. We're going back to biblical times. You know what? I think perhaps some more can come up. Yeah, well, you can all come up. You know, you'll be able to see.
Yes. Yeah. So first of all, you can see how beautiful it is. Remarkable the top of the crown.
They're only on Shirat Hayan. They're not in the other places.
So there's a letter. Oh, yeah.